women were having fewer children. At the same time, our largest generation, the baby boomers, are getting older. And on the upper end, they're leaving the workforce. In fact, only about 25% of people over 65 are in the workforce today. So we've got exodus on the top and fewer entrants on the bottom, and that's creating a pinch.
In your book, Super Age, you talk about how super age isn't coming. It's here right now. So why are executives still planning for a world that is no longer existing? Why are these two things coexisting and yet we're still living as if it's not?
Well, demographics is like water. It's slow moving, and if you don't address it fast enough, it will in fact cause damage. And that's what we're in right now. It's the great pinch where all of a sudden businesses from across the United States and around the world are waking up to a new demographic reality because it's finally pinched them. And that's a question for the larger society. Do we want to grow our population?
This is Career Blast in a half.
I bet you never met a demographic strategist before. Well, guess what? It's your lucky day. And we have Bradley Schurman here, and he is the real deal. He is a demographic strategist and also the founder of Human Change. That's a global advisory firm that helps organizations navigate through these big seismic demographic shifts to build resiliency for labor and consumer markets. He also is the co-founder of New Rules Media, and that is also data-driven, a media company focusing on, yes, many of the same hallmarks: resilience, innovation, and change. Whew. And so now, go for it, because now it's the real deal. I just put this red carpet out. Come on, Brad. So happy to have you.
I'm really glad to be here. And I look forward to our conversation today. I think it's going to be phenomenal.
So I think the first kind of big area that I want to probe, because not all of us are in the weeds with demographic changes. I mean, we hear tidbits here and there, I'll drop mentions on my post, but it's not something that the average person is kind of going deep in studying. So in your book, Super Age, you talk about how super age isn't coming. It's here. It's here right now. So why are executives still planning for a world that is no longer existing? Why are these two things coexisting and yet we're still living as if it's not?
I think the simple answer is muscle memory. And most executives today are likely between the ages of 45 and maybe 65, 70 plus on the top end. And the world that they grew up in was a world where we had a pretty solid pipeline of workers. And that pipeline shifted sometime around the great financial crisis, the Great Recession, that is, where our birth rate here in the United States dipped below replacement rate. And that, in layman's terms, means that women were having fewer children. And you'd say, oh, Brad, okay, so women are having fewer children. That's a good thing, right? Well, depends on your point of view. But the reality is that pipeline shrunk about 20 years ago. And now that pipeline is showing up to work a lot smaller. At the same time, our largest generation, the baby boomers, are getting older. They've hit retirement age or approaching in the next year or two. And on the upper end, they're leaving the workforce. In fact, only about 25% of people over 65 are in the workforce today. So we've got exodus on the top and fewer entrants on the bottom, and that's creating a pinch. So people will often say to me the same thing. Why should I care about demographics? Well, demographics is like water. It's slow moving, and if you don't address it fast enough, it will in fact cause damage. And that's what we're in right now. It's the great pinch where all of a sudden businesses from across the United States and around the world are waking up to a new demographic reality because it's finally pinched them. They can finally feel the pain. And now they have to start adjusting their systems accordingly. And as you know, as somebody who's worked within corporate spaces for decades, it takes a long time to move a corporation. It takes an even longer time to move a society. So this stuff that we're experiencing today and will experience, quite frankly, for the rest of our working lives, at least you and me, this is something that was built in 20 years ago.
So it's just at that tipping point, so to say. Is that fair?
It's at that tipping point. So Gen Z is a smaller generation than the millennials. Gen Alpha is a smaller generation than Gen Z. And Gen Beta, the generation that is just starting to be born this year, will likely be even smaller if all of these trends hold. Now, what has held up the U.S. economy? What has held up the U.S. population? That's been immigration. Almost exclusively, our population is growing because of immigration. But this year, thanks to the current administration, we may actually have one of the first years where we have fewer immigrants coming in. And that means that our demographic pinch will be a lot harder and a lot faster. All of the social programs will come under more strain because there'll be fewer people paying taxes into the system. With consumer markets, we'll have fewer people to sell to domestically. And of course, on the labor side, there are simply fewer workers. And everyone says this. I'm always stopped and they say, well, wait a second, Brad, hold on a second. What about AI and automation? I mean, that's going to save us, right? Yes, it will help. It will help out tremendously in improving efficiencies across organizations. But I'd like you to show me one computer, one machine, anywhere in the world that has purchased a product or paid a cent in taxes. And you will not find that anywhere in the world today. So we have a people problem, and it's a problem that we're not addressing holistically. You'll hear these conversations on national news about baby bonuses in terms of tax benefits. But that's not going to get us to where we need to get to if we want to grow our population. And that's a question for the larger society. Do we want to grow our population?
Do we want to grow it? Right. I mean, there's so many. Obviously, that's a totally different podcast.
It is.
And I'm not qualified to talk about anybody's, birth rate or expectancy or anything like that. But my point, my question, I guess I should say is, in this wonderful analogy that you talked about, how it's like water and how, over years it kind of, causes a lot of damage. Can you describe the mold that's accumulating? Can you describe what is stuck? What are the fundamental one or two things that you would classify as the horrible impact of all this water? I mean, one I know you said is that.
Well, I think I highlighted that it's economic stagnation, and that is a big fear. Is that this economic stagnation will sink in, and in fact, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, has even warned about the potential for stagflation, which is where the economy doesn't grow, but wages do, and that causes an inflationary period, blah, blah, blah. He's the economist. I'm not.
Right.
But long story short, it's not a good thing. And what I am blessed to know is that this has happened in other places before, because the United States sits kind of at the middle of this demographic curve. We're not the oldest country by far. We're certainly not the youngest, but we can look at countries like Japan, for example, that's been embroiled in these challenges now for decades and say, what happened there? Well, stagflation, slower economic growth, depopulation of entire regions, huge strains on the nation's finances, including its pensions and healthcare systems. Have they done much to adjust in Japan? They've done some, but has it been enough? No, and we should be able to learn from that, both as business leaders, but also as a society with our political leaders. And I would say the third thing is, in this period of what I'd like to call demographic contraction or demographic strain, we need to be focused on having everyone who is able having a seat at the table. And that means that anyone who has the ability to be a productive member of society, where they are working and consuming, we should welcome them with open arms. And that is easier said than done, right? Because
Yeah,
we're
I'm going to
talking
vote
about
for you for president.
yeah, I mean, it reminds me of that movie from the 1990s. I think it was Dave.
Oh, yeah.
Everyone gets a job. I mean,
Yes.
everyone who wants to have a job in this country should have a job in this country. The nature of work, though, really does shift over the life course. And our systems, as they're built within corporations, are frankly too rigid for the structure of the modern workforce and the modern family. And without modifying our systems accordingly, and this is up to business leaders as much as it is up to the president and policymakers, if we're not adjusting, we're going to see a real dearth of talent coming into our organizations. And I think the last thing is, so there's 3 there, and I'll just put this one on as icing on the cake.
Bonus. Yeah.
I don't think that HR departments and corporate leaders have fully embraced the shift away from recruitment to retention as core strategy. Right now, and I think because we got drunk on just this never-ending pool of labor for really since 64, 65, when the boomers started coming in, it's a long period to have all these extra people at your back. And now that's drying up. So we got used to the churn, people staying in jobs for 3 to 5 years. They left, no big deal. There's somebody else to replace them. That is not a hard truth anymore.
Oh no, it's about three and a half years before that next turn. And I mean, that is something that we in our practice are explaining to our clients over and over, right? If you're going in and looking for a job right now, I get that. But you also need to be building that baseline and that network and all those things so that another 3 something years from now, you're not starting from scratch.
Exactly. Exactly. But I think we are starting to see some movement in this. So there's a bright side to all of this. And the bright side is that there are leading businesses now that are building benefit structures, working environments that are more responsive to the life course. So, in the 1990s, we saw businesses, not all of them, but we saw businesses respond to mothers in the workplace. Was it universal? No, but we saw people move to that. Today, we're starting to see more businesses be responsive to women in midlife, offering either menopausal benefits, HRT therapy, et cetera, and the insurance plans, perhaps trainings for coworkers to understand the condition, both as people who are experiencing it, but also people who are not going to be living with it. Men, I'm looking at you. But also, I think we're starting to see flexible work arrangements and support for caregivers emerging as well. And that, I think, is a real bright side of all of this. Like, it's not all gloom and doom. There is some pivoting. There is some tacking of the sails that businesses are doing because they are starting to see that recruitment as the only strategy for success no longer works. It's all about retention. How do you keep people past that 5-year horizon into 10, 15, 20, or even more years? And that's a real big shift. And it looks a bit like the past. My grandfather worked for Westinghouse for 35 years. They constantly invested in him, constantly invested in his work and his training, in the supports that he needed to have, a good family, a good salary. We might have to be moving back to that in the coming years.
You're watching me cross my fingers for that whole shift that you talked about. I love that, recruitment to retention. Build it, reinvest, continue, and rinse and repeat. I love that. I hope from your lips to the universe's ears.
Yeah, and I think it's likely. I mean, I think that's the the upside here is because if you just focus on fundamentals of economics, supply and demand,
Man.
the supply has shrunk, the demand still exists, and you can find all the efficiencies in the world with machines if you want, but you're still going to have to deal with the ramifications of having smaller consumer groups on the other end. So, I like to say the future is inclusive, whether we like it or not.
So I have to ask this question, and for those of you who are listening, I'm asking this question for you. So I want to know too, but really, so like, thank you for all this wonderful demographic information and all of these economic factoids and all these pieces. But now I'm going to ask you the real question. Okay, like, thanks a lot, Brad. We know that there is this labor shortage, and shouldn't I be hireable? Shouldn't it be easy for me because the demand or the supply is so much more finite? Why am I at a certain age, 40 plus around? Why is it so much harder for me? Why can't people just come running to me when there isn't enough people to fill these open roles or roles that are created? And why am I still apologizing for my age?
Yeah, that's always a tough one, but it comes with a fairly simple answer, and it's threefold. The first is that the systems are built against you. Businesses are trained to think that as we age, we lose skills, we lose elasticity, we become kind of rigid in our ways. And that is not always the case. There's also this fundamental belief that exists that older adults, those past 40, 45 and above, that they aren't adaptable to new technologies. And this is one of the greatest falsehoods that's out there, but we'll let them have it for a moment, because there may have been a time when that was the case. But Gen X in particular has survived multiple technological revolutions in their lifetime. If there's ever been a generation that is adaptable, it's likely the Gen X cohort.
Exactly.
So that's the one thing. There's bias, and it might be age bias if you want to call it that. Ageism in the workplace. The second piece is cost. And we live in a world where as you progress through your career, God willing, you earn more in your career. And when an organization is looking at the balance sheet and they see that person X costs 2x, 3x person Y, and they're doing roughly the same job, it does raise a red flag about whether or not they should keep that person. So there are those occasions, especially when they're doing headcount reductions in force, that they look at the balance sheet and say, God, I love person X, but they just cost too much and they don't have the right level of performance to match that. It isn't ageism in that conversation. It's simply a balance sheet question. And then the third piece, I think, actually really belongs to the individual. You've got this bias that sits over here. You've got this reality of you likely costing more than a junior person, and you might be doing a same or similar job. How can you adjust accordingly to that new reality? Well, you have to fight like tooth and nail for that position. And you have to prove to your employer that you're worth it. And yes, again, that's easier said than done. But I have met men and women well into their 60s that are getting brand new jobs. Maybe it's taken them longer, but it does take a long time to get into a position these days. And what I've found that connects these folks is real adaptability to scenarios. They've got incredible communication skills. They are universally creative in their approaches. And when you meet them, the first thing you don't think is, oh, they're 60 something. You think, wow, what a great, innovative individual. And that to me is what we should be ascribing to, or at least pushing forward for ourselves, is constant reinvention. Because without question, we are living in the most disruptive period that we've experienced as a nation and perhaps the world in at least 100 years. And when things are this disruptive, shifts in climate, shifts in technology, shifts in communication, shifts in the nature of work, we have to adapt accordingly or we get left in the past. And while the parallels aren't perfect here, think about some of the jobs that existed 30 years ago that just don't exist anymore. The same will hold true for employment today. There will be changes. And I like to think about, the examples from the early 20th century of the lamplighters that came in through each town before electricity. Those guys don't exist anymore.
Right.
The people that dressed horses for use every day, that doesn't exist anymore. I think about the realities of the office place that I went to, where every director and above had a secretary. That doesn't exist
And
anymore.
wore a tie.
Exactly. And the nature of just how people dress was different. And I want to put a really fine point here about the state of things that we're currently in right now, specifically around artificial intelligence. Because
Please.
I hear people say all the time, I don't know why I'd use that. I don't need that. I'm a good writer. I'm a this, I'm a that. I know my skill set. When you entered the workforce 30, 40 years ago, and somebody introduced you to the personal computer, did you embrace it?
You better
Imagine,
be,
and
better
then,
believe it, right? I know
and then
I'm
imagine
right.
if you hadn't embraced it. And I think that puts a super fine point on the place that we're in right now and really emphasizes that for those of us who are in that post 40, post 45 period, that we have to go through yet another adaptation in work after we've seen so many. This is just one more. And if you show resistance to change, that paints a giant bullseye on your back.
I could not echo this any louder. A lot of what there's so much going on with AI, and it's on every headline, on every publication, 24/7. One of the more recent ones I saw was the headline was AI or else,
Yeah.
right? AI or else. I think it was Andrew Jancey over at Amazon, right? And I do think that is probably the most the most accurate bumper sticker that we should all be, putting on ourselves, because it's moving fast. You do not need to be a guru or, Conor Grennan or, anybody like that who is in it 24/7, but you must be able to answer those questions about how you're using it and how it's impacting your industry, and what how your life has been, integrated with it on some level, because it ain't going away. And I think that it's really going to create people who decided, hell yeah, and people that raised their hand and said, no thanks.
Yeah, and it's the same thing that happened 30, 40 years ago when the computer and the internet became normalized in our workplaces. Was this is a new tool, and those who know how to use it and use it well will rise to the top, and those that don't will slip into oblivion. But again, there's a silver line here, especially for older workers, is that we grew up in a world that was truly pre-digital.
Oh
And
yeah.
we grew up in this analog world, and people like to put a black mark on us because of it. The fact that we drank from the fire hose, we were latchkey kids, free range, go out, don't come home until dark. But in this period, this early years of our lives, this lack of digitalization in our lives really laid the foundation for three core assets that I think set older workers apart. And I call them the three C's. And I think they're essential for the modern workplace. And that's creativity, communication, and compassion. And these three skills, if you have them, people love to call these things soft skills, but if you have these skills and can really hone them in this new artificial intelligence, generative AI world, you are going to do phenomenal work. But you have to have them. You have to have them. And I think even other softer skills, not the non-technical skills, are ones that will really shine now too. people who have grounding in history, people have grounding in understanding, long-term trends. They'll be able to pick this stuff apart and decide what really works and what doesn't. Because AI, I have to remind people of this, AI is a giant mirror on society. It reflects literally every bias we have. So if you're not curious enough to confront that and question it, if you're not compassionate enough to know that the default is white, is male, is, the list goes on, you're not going to be able to get the best results from it. And of course, if you can't talk to it, because it is a new language, it is a new being of sorts, you're not going to be able to crack that code. No pun intended, of course.
That was a good one. So I want to talk about this kind of, I guess, power struggle between the mandates that employees feel, or candidates in the market. You must be relevant. You must be all these things. You must be, all this, only to find out that the companies themselves are not necessarily relevant. So where is that middle ground? Where is that come to Jesus moment where is it coming that there's going to be some allowances on both sides? Yes, you need to be relevant candidate. And yes, you company also need to see beyond the biases in the system. Because I don't know about you, but my feeling is the applicant tracking system isn't going to be doing that on its own.
No. I mean, I think we entered too in the COVID era, we had the Great Resignation, but in subsequent years, I've called it the Great Renegotiation. And it's a very messy process, but it's one that we've been through before, the renegotiation of the relationship between the employee and the employer. And we're just smack dab in the middle of it right now. And it's ironic that you asked this question, because in the first few months of COVID, somebody said to me, what does this do, this work from home? What does this do for the future of work? And I said, we're going to a 4-day work week. And people said, what do you mean? And I said, well, that'll be the long-term trend, because we've been nudging towards it already. This is a disruptive event. It will probably last 2 to 3 years, the disruption. That's not enough for it to really stick. And businesses have a vested interest in getting you back into the office. But will that be 5 days? And my answer, based on deep research and understanding of the marketplace and other pressures on employers and employees, landed on 4 days. That 4 days might look different to people depending on their working situation or how flexible their employer is. But it's going to boil down to 4 days. And that could be, 3 days at 12 hours a day. It could be 5 days at, 6 hours a day, or it could just be, 4 days at 10 hours a day. But you're going to end up in the office for 4 days one way or another. There will be very few people that are going to be exempted from this. And if they are, they're likely doing very, I would say, technically specific work that doesn't require a lot of collaboration and a lot of camaraderie amongst their coworkers. Accounting comes to mind. No offense to the accountants out there, but there's some bookkeeping that you can do without a team. But if you're working in a creative industry, if you're working in tech, if you're working in consumer products or advertising, that hive mind, that ability to be in an office, as much as we, besmirch it, is really important, I believe, to our creativity. It's also really important for our communities, because if these offices aren't filled, if the streets aren't bustling with people, what do we do with a place like New York City? We can't just change this place overnight. So the negotiation here is much more than just, I only want to be in the office 3 days a week, or I want to be fully remote. It's far deeper than that. But 4 days is likely where we're going to land on average.
So I was also referring to the embracing of older workers in the workforce.
Yeah, well, that's the same thing. I mean, the employers are going to get there, but it's going to take some time. we have spent as a society since about 1935, and really it sped up about 1965 when the boomers really entered the workplace in earnest. We spent decades encouraging people to leave the workplace based on the premise that they were going to live this really phenomenal retirement. But as I point out in my book, The Super Age, this started to shift in the 1990s. We started to see that people were waking up to the reality, women in particular at first, especially those that were divorced or widowed, that this contract, this social contract that we had, was not paying out the way it was supposed to. And I talk in the book about one of my favorite shows, The Golden Girls. This is one of the first shows that addressed this up front. But there were other movies, other things in popular culture like Cocoon that touched on this as well. But this is in the 90s, the early 90s, as we start to see these conversations emerge. Societies take decades to shift. Well, the mid 90s was how long ago? About 30 years ago. So we're now at that inflection point where we went from about 14% of the workforce being 14% of workers over 65 being engaged in work to now 25%. That is a big jump in a very short period of time. And we've actually seen the number of workers over 65 double since 2000. That is a massive shift in a very short period of time. So while there is a lot of bemoaning and there are a lot of people that are struggling with employment right now, I get it. I feel you. It was a lot worse in the 1990s, and it is getting better. Businesses are waking up to this. It might not be as fast as you want, but neither business nor society turns on a dime. And that doesn't offer people a lot of hope, especially people who've been out of work for a year or two, struggling to find their way back onto the ladder, back into the workplace. But I can't speak to those individual experiences. I can speak to the data. And where we're going is back to a historic norm. And some people will hate this too. Some people are going to hate this too. We're going back to a historic norm, whether we like it or not. So be careful what you wish for, where people will work until they can't. Either they expire or they become infirmed to such a point that they cannot work anymore. And the signs and signals are everywhere that are pointing us to this. In fact, as many people know, I'm sure many of your listeners know, in the next 8 years, the Social Security Fund runs out of money. And this means that everyone who's getting a Social Security check, well, that's going to drop in value by about 20 to 25%. The one thing we know is constant about cost these days is the rising cost of healthcare. Guess what runs out after Social Security? The Medicare Trust Fund. So people who are older will be confronted with two really stark realities: smaller income from Social Security, higher expenses from Medicare and healthcare. So it's not a very pretty situation, but these are macro forces that are actually pushing us into this new norm of working longer. Now, will we see big companies chomping at the bit to hire workers? I don't know. I can't say that for sure. But what we might see is an increase in portfolio type work that you're engaged in. We might see a growth of cottage industries emerge, people, cobbling their skills together. We might see, as I've experienced across the country, as I've traveled into rural communities, people just staying in the job that they've had forever. And then people who enter back into the workforce working in minimum wage or low wage jobs because that's what's available. 20 years ago, as I was traveling 25 years ago, between Pittsburgh and DC, my family's in Pittsburgh. I would see this. I would see these men and women that were my grandparents' age working in fast food, gas stations, service stops. I was so befuddled by that then. That's going to be the norm. That's going to be the norm. And, we can debate it till we're blue in the face. That's not fair. That's great. It's happening. And this is a train that has left the station. There are things that might speed up this transition, but we're going back to that. And we can only do what I do well, I think, is point to the past as our guide. And in that post-war period where we had a hyper demand for labor, and a very limited supply following World War II, Men over 65, at least 1 out of 2 of them were engaged in work. So are we marching back towards that? Are we racing back towards that? There are a lot of variables right now that we can't fully predict how fast the transition will happen, but it is moving at a very quick clip.
Wow. I mean, this is the best broadcast I've ever listened to from you, because it's so much incredible intel and clarity. It's not a guarantee, but it's so helpful in terms of benchmarking, forecasting, and understanding these trends. And I am curious, go out on a limb here, knowing what you know, Bradley, knowing what you know, all these different things. Pretend that you're a 52, 3-year-old person who is in the job market right now. What would you tell them with all this intel packed away in your psyche, and knowing what you know about the audience of corporate and how they hire? What would you say to them?
I would give them 3 pointers. The first is your relationships at work and within your community of peers outside of your workplace are some of the most important relationships that you have to build resilience in the future. People don't hire off job boards. That's typically a place of last resort. Get those relationships hardened up fast, because that disruption could happen at any day, quite frankly, where there is a reduction in force. Which I think is a very DC term, so apologies for that. Reduction in
It's all
force.
good. We translated for you. That's all good.
The second piece is that you have to illustrate to your employer at every single turn that you're a part of the team, you're contributing at or above what's expected, and this is just the nature, because their muscle memory still says, I can get somebody in that's younger and cheaper, or I can get 3 people for the cost of you. You have to really continue to show your value. What's your value proposition to the workplace? And that might involve retraining. That might involve, taking those extra courses that your employer might offer that nobody uses, or going to the local community college, which offers very low cost, typically, courses on these different things that can help you reskill. And then you might have to start thinking about the plan of what if. What if I'm that person that gets laid off? How do I build some protections for me now that will get me through a worst case scenario? And that worst case scenario would be that you'd be drawing down your 401k. How do I know that I have, a year or 2 at least of savings in place, that worst case scenario fund? Because as I found, if you prepare for the worst, it often doesn't lead to that, because your mindset has shifted to a point where you're in a forward leaning position. You're not in a reactive mode, you're in an attack mode. And those 3 things, I think, when taken together, really will help somebody who's, in that 50-ish space, really build protections around themselves for what could come, what might come if they do nothing at all.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
I mean, it always goes back to relationships. I mean,
It does.
we interview hundreds of people and they echo that entirely. It's not an overnight matter. Those relationships, and a lot of people also talk about how their networks have atrophied, they've gone cold. It's okay. Like, that's sometimes life happens. It doesn't mean that they can't be warmed up. It doesn't mean that they're not going to be happy to see you either.
Yeah, and this, I would say, is maybe a bit of advice for your younger listeners, because
Please.
Younger people think that they're immune from all of this until they wake up one day and they're 50 years old and they say, oh, wow, what happened? I'm now on the cutting block. Investing in intergenerational relationships in the workplace is so wildly important. And people tend to dismiss this. They think, oh, I've got to make sure that I know the guy above me, the guy at the top, the gal at the top, the manager, the director, the CEO. I got to make sure I have those relationships. Those people will likely retire before you do. So those
Mm-hmm.
relationships with people who are below you, people you hire, people you might work alongside at some point, either them in junior roles or at peer roles, those people are really important too, because they're going to be the hiring managers of the future. And I think about all the people that I've mentored, the folks that I've had as interns, that have worked below or aside me. I've invested in those relationships long term, and I know that I can call on those folks someday if anything were to happen, because I've invested in them, and I can expect that they'll invest back in me.
I love that. That's such a great point, because it just reminds me, when my dad was alive, he was big into the world of business, and before there was such a thing as, kind of like what we know today as work-life balance, he was a big thought leader. I couldn't agree with you more. And I actually share this strategy a lot of times. If you're trying to break into a company, don't just go to the C-suite or the executive level, because some of the folks who are at the more junior level are apt to convert those conversations and connect with you a lot easier. And don't forget, they're probably the ones that are going to be getting the referral bonuses anyway.
Yeah.
So those people are incentivized. It means $5,000 means a lot more to them than it could mean to somebody who is significantly higher and could be exempt from those referrals.
And you and I both know that there are people that are at the middle level of a workplace that are actually the real movers and shakers. They just haven't been promoted up to the executive team, but they know where everybody is buried. They know exactly what moves things internally and externally. Those are the real powerhouses behind organizations, and they're the ones you need to find. I mean, it's very much like Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point. Those people really do exist. They are not some fantasy land. They are real things, and they are invaluable for your career.
I can't thank you enough. I really can't. You are just a wonderful strategist, demographic strategist, and you have brought us so much insight today. Your book, I will include the link for super aging, and I am forever indebted to all the work that you're doing at new rules, creating new rules, talking about the longevity economy, and just such an incredible swath of information and impact along the way. So for all of you, please make sure, first of all, go hire Bradley, bring him into your company. God damn it. And then also make sure that you follow him on LinkedIn, get his book, link below. And if that wasn't enough, if you like this episode and our show, which is like seriously growing, I just got the numbers today, so I'm so excited. Please write a Apple Podcast review and tell us what you took away, because we love hearing from you. All right. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you next week with another either solo episode or a guest. We haven't figured that out yet. All right.
Thank you for joining today. We appreciate your listening ears. Big time. We ask this: use these tools, not tomorrow, right now, and share them by spreading the love, leaving us a rating and subscribe so you don't miss the next Career Blast in a Half. Most of all, thank you for you.